Hi, this is Greg Campbell, and today I'm going to talk a little bit about soil health. I'm just going to cover the basics. Now, I'm not a soil scientist. I don't have a PhD in soil science or agronomy or any of the biosciences or anything like that. This is all from a farmer's perspective, and I figure that's the way you'd like to hear it. One of the first questions that always comes up when people talk about soil health is, what does that mean? And I can understand the confusion, because it's like describing the perfect car or the perfect woman or the perfect man or the perfect farm. I don't know how you describe that. So let's just get into the basic principles of building soil health and what you can do to build a healthy soil on your farm or in your backyard or in your garden. The first principle is to minimize disturbance wherever you can. It means don't disturb the soil. It means don't tear it up, till it up, beat it up. I know it seems like when you go in there with a spade or a shovel or a 300 horsepower tractor with a 30-foot V-ripper behind it, that you're loosening the soil. And initially you are. But in the long term, you're actually tearing down the soil structure and compacting it. And if you think about that, it makes perfect sense, because if you want to make something smaller, you go in there and rip it to smaller chunks, and it will pack in tighter. And that's exactly what you do when you run a tillage tool through your field. Another thing that you do when you do that is you cut off the earthworms from their food supply. Now, there's two kinds of earthworms here in Ohio. In Darke County, Ohio, we have two different types of earthworms. There are the ones that dwell in the shallow areas of the soil. Usually during the temperate months of the year, they're in the first 12 inches or so, but they'll go as deep as 24 inches when the weather gets too hot or too cold for them, and they'll hide there. They're not really affected very much by tillage. The ones that are really affected by tillage are the night crawlers, because they channel very deep into the soil, but their food supply is up on top of the soil, and they build a mouth to their burrow that's called a midden, and they will come out at night or in cool weather and draw plant material that's on top of the soil to the mouth of that and pull it down in a little ways to soften it up, and then that's what they feed on. When you go through with a tillage tool, you cut off the top of their house. You block the door to their house so that they can't get out to get the groceries. Another thing that you do with tillage is you tear up the mycorrhizal fungus, and we're going to talk about that more in later videos, because it's one of the more important things that's going on in our soil that a lot of people aren't aware of. But there is a fungus in the soil that is related to the roots of the plants, and it can stretch out over miles and interconnect the plants, and it makes nutrients more available to the plants. When you pull a tillage tool through the soil, you tear up that network. It's kind of like the internet. If you cut all the wires off, if you cut off all the fiber optic cable, things can't communicate with each other anymore. And that's what we do with tillage. When you do tillage, you introduce air, atmospheric air, into the soil, which seems like a good thing because you do get a carbon flush, and it does increase the crop growth of the subsequent crop when you do that. But what you're doing is you're throwing the bacterial balance out of whack in the soil. There are aerobic bacteria, the ones that like to have air, and there are anaerobic bacteria in the soil which don't like to have air. When you introduce all that air into the soil, you're promoting the aerobic bacteria and sacrificing the anaerobic bacteria. It's kind of the same thing that happens when you get too much rain and the soil lays underwater. The anaerobic bacteria take over, the aerobic bacteria die. So you're creating an imbalance there. And one of the things that you're going to hear me talk about constantly as I produce these videos is balance in the soil. And it's a word that I think we've forgotten, that we need to relearn again. When you do tillage, as I mentioned, you think that you're loosening up the soil so that it can take water better, but any of you fellows that have been farming for a long time know that when you till a piece of soil and disc it down nice and neat so that you can plant your corn and everything, and you get a hard pounding rain on it, it crusts over on the top and then the water can't get in. Now, I'm not going to beat that horse to death, but y'all know that it happens, and it's time that we acknowledge it. And the second thing that happens is that we have more erosion with the tillage system than we have with the no-till system, because that loose soil is obviously going to wash off the top easier than a tight soil is. So I'm going to get off of tillage now, and I'm going to move on to the next principle of a healthy soil, which is diversity. It's specifically plant diversity, but that leads to biological diversity underground and above ground both. We need crop rotations that are more diverse than just corn and soybeans, or even more diverse than just corn, soybeans, and wheat. The more different species of plants that you have through your fields, the more different kinds of food you're feeding your soil, and the biology that lives within it. And one of the key points of soil health is that we're trying to promote the biology in the soil, because it's the soil that feeds your plants, and it's the biology in the soil that makes all of that happen. So the more different types of plants and different plant species that you have going through your soil, the more different kinds of food you're putting down there, and you're collecting more solar energy and more carbon and nitrogen from the air and putting that into the soil and providing that energy to your crops when you want it. The idea of having plant diversity in the soil also feeds into your soil structure again, because different plants have different root structures. They root to different depths. They have different root types. Some have a big tap root. Some have more fibrous roots. Some are legumes. Some are not. And they release different sugar compounds and different feed compounds into the soil, and they affect the soil structure in different ways. The third principle of healthy soil, or soil health, is to have a root in the ground at all possible times, and that's a living root in the ground at all possible times. That leads into cover crops, which is one of the buzzwords in farming these days, and I know that everybody's interested in cover crops, and anybody who's talked to me at any length knows that I certainly am, but I don't want to make this come off like I'm preaching cover crops, because you have to be very responsible with them. They can be a problem for you as much as they can be a solution for you, but having a living root in the ground is going to do more for you than any tillage or any crop rotation ever could. If you have a living root in there, you're gathering sunlight and carbon and nitrogen out of the atmosphere, which is free to you, and you're putting it in the ground where it can do you some good. You're building your soil organic matter, which increases your soil's ability to hold water and to take in water. It reduces the runoff. When you have that heavy rain where you get 2 inches of rain in an hour and all of the water runs off of the top and goes into the ground, it reduces that. And again, it feeds the biology that's under the soil, which is where the nutrients really come from. And it takes up the excess nutrients that you may have put onto your soil. I don't think anyone that is involved in production agriculture doesn't understand that every time we spread fertilizer on the land, we're losing part of it. It's washing out the bottom or vaporizing out the top. You guys know the technical terms for that as well as I do. You know it's happening. You just don't know what to do about it. Well, one of the things that you can do about it is have a living root in the ground all the time to take those nutrients up and hold it in a plant. When that plant dies, it will release it back into the soil so that you have it for subsequent crops. And the last principle that we're going to cover today on soil health is having the soil covered. Now, that sounds similar to having a root in the ground all the time, because that means a cover crop of some kind, whether it's something that you can monetize or not. But even if it's dead plant residue laying on top of the soil. For instance, after you harvest your corn for grain, and I'm not talking about silage corn because silage corn removes all of that residue and you don't have it there. I'm talking about after you harvest your corn or your wheat, and to a lesser degree the soybeans, all of that plant material that's left over after you extract the grain, leave it laying on top of the soil. Don't chop it up. Don't mash it down. Just let it stand there. That's going to do a few things for you. It's a food supply for the earthworms and the other biology that lives underground, as we discussed. And also, it breaks up the impact of the raindrops as they come down from the sky. And the force of a raindrop hitting the ground is rather astounding, and it causes compaction. Again, you fellows that grow soybeans on a field that's been heavily tilled understand the problem that you plant your soybeans and then a pounding rain comes along and now the soybeans are crusted in and they break their backs trying to get out of the ground. You guys that are production farmers that grow soybeans know exactly what I'm talking about. Having that cover crop out there, having that plant residue out there will alleviate that to some degree. Again, you have runoff and erosion issues. If you can keep from compacting that soil on just the top quarter of an inch or just the top half of an inch from that raindrop impact, if you can keep some pore space open up there on that upper layer, the water's going to go into the ground more readily rather than just flow off of the top of it. Having that plant residue out there on top of the ground is also going to keep your soil temperature a little bit warmer when it gets cold, a little bit cooler when it gets hot. What that really means in the wintertime when you're not doing any farming, it doesn't really mean anything. In the springtime when you're getting ready to plant, I did some temperature samples of the soils this year of both my soils which were under a cover crop and soils neighboring me that were not under a cover crop and were tilled, and I found that in the mornings my covered soils were warmer in the mornings than the bare tilled soil next door, and they were a little bit cooler in the evenings than the bare tilled soil next door, but as an average temperature through the day they were about the same. So for the same soil temperature and the same moisture content, I still had that cover out there so that I was adding organic matter into the soil and feeding the underground livestock, the earthworms and the other biology that's under the soil, which are going to build my soil organic matter. Now, as a caveat to this whole talk that I've just given, I want to talk about soil organic matter. It's one of the things that you're going to hear me talk about at great length because I think it's one of the most important things that we need to focus on. I farm in an area where historically, if you go back 150 years or even just 100 years, these soils where I'm at in Darke County, Ohio, are soils which would have had 8 or 9 or 10% soil organic matter. And actually 2 days ago I pulled some soil samples from some areas where I know the soil hasn't been disturbed for about 100 years, and then within a 100-foot radius some that has been out of production for about 10 years, and some that's been under a no-till regimen with cover crops for about 2 years, and some that is still under a full broadacre tillage program. And I haven't gotten those test results back yet, but the thing that I'm going to be looking on those is the soil organic matter and see what the comparison is. I know how the soil probe felt going into the ground, and it's August the 10th in 2016, and we haven't had a lot of rain here recently. The only place that I took a sample where I could push the probe down into the ground in one go without having to turn it and tap it with my foot again was directly in the fence row where I know it hasn't been disturbed for 100 years. What that's going to mean in the soil test results, I don't know. I'm going to share those when I get them in. But the soil organic matter is one of the prime indicators of whether or not we have a healthy soil. Now, I mentioned that the soils here where I am in history back 100 or 150 years ago would have been 8 to 10% or soil organic matter. The best soils that I have on this farm right now are 3. Some of them are pushing 3.5, but some of them are as low as 2% soil organic matter. So in 100 years, we've gotten rid of 4/5 of the soil organic matter on this farm. Now, why is that important? Well, I think you guys will all agree that a black soil will grow a better crop. Well, a black soil has higher soil organic matter, and it's able to drain better. It's able to hold more water. It's able to take more water. It doesn't crust up. It doesn't get tight and hard. You fellows have been farming for a while. You know these things. We just haven't been paying attention to them. So I don't want to preach too much. I just wanted to share these things. The principles that I've laid out for you here today are the principles of soil health that the NRCS will put out there for you and tell you. I've tried to keep this in terms of a farmer's perspective and not use too much technical jargon with it, because as I said before, I'm not a credentialed soil scientist or anything. I'm just a farmer who's gotten very interested in these things, and I think it's important. And I just want to share those things with you as I've learned them. Have a great evening, and thank you.